deeply integrated economic relationship in the history of the modern world. The United States, Canada, and Mexico have built something over the last 3 decades that most economists would have called a miracle, a single, fused supply chain, a near seamless flow of goods, energy, labor, and capital across 3 sovereign borders. And right now, that entire architecture is being deliberately dismantled, piece by piece, by one man in the White House who seems absolutely convinced that the pain is worth it. The question you should be asking, and the question we are going to answer today, is not whether Trump is wrong or right. The real question is what this moment actually tells us about the deeper forces reshaping the global order, who wins, who loses, who is truly in control, and what it means for your wallet, your job, and the kind of country you are going to be living in 5 years from now. Because this is not a trade dispute. This is a battle over the future architecture of power itself. And once you see what is actually happening beneath the surface of these headlines, you cannot unsee it. Let's start by grounding ourselves in what actually happened and what is still happening right now, because the timeline matters enormously. On February 1st, 2025, a trade war against Canada and Mexico began when President Donald Trump signed executive orders imposing near-universal tariffs on goods from both countries, 25% on most imports from Mexico and Canada, with Canadian oil and energy taxed at a lower 10% rate. And almost immediately, both neighbors fired back. In response, then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada would retaliate with 25% tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars of American goods, which would expand to 155 billion Canadian dollars after 3 weeks. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said Mexico would enact tariffs and non-tariff retaliation against the United States. Now here is where you have to slow down and think carefully, because the official narrative coming out of Washington frames all of this around fentanyl and illegal immigration. And yes, those are real concerns. Trump himself made his position crystal clear. He said that the tariffs were necessary to stop the flood of illegal aliens and drugs, and that while there might be short-term disruption, the protection of Americans demanded it. But if you take a step back and look at the actual mechanics of what was set in motion, a very different picture begins to emerge. Because the fentanyl problem, while real, was already being addressed. Sheinbaum touted her government's record since she took office in October, seizing 20 million doses of fentanyl, in addition to detaining over 10,000 people tied to drug trafficking. And yet, the tariffs came anyway. So if both Mexico and Canada were demonstrably cooperating on the stated rationales, why escalate the economic confrontation to this degree? That is the question that opens the door to a much more revealing understanding of what this moment is really about. The answer has to do with something deeper than drugs or immigration. It has to do with the fundamental question of who controls the economic architecture of North America and, by extension, who shapes the trajectory of Western power in a world that is rapidly reorganizing itself. The executive order includes an escalation clause, warning of increased rates if the countries retaliate. Although the tariffs were announced under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, if made permanent, they would effectively dismantle the USMCA. This is the most significant threat to North American trade integration since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Let that sink in for a moment. Not since 1930. Not since the policy that deepened and prolonged the Great Depression has any American administration moved so aggressively to wall off its own economic relationships. The historical parallel alone should stop you cold. Now let's talk about the economic reality on the ground, because this is where most Americans are actually living and breathing these decisions, whether they realize it or not. China, Mexico, and Canada are the 3 largest trading partners with the US, as measured by imported goods. They supplied about 536 billion, 455 billion, and 437 billion of goods respectively to the US in 2022. These are not abstract numbers. That is the food in your grocery store. That is the car in your driveway. That is the lumber in your house and the steel in your refrigerator and the aluminum in every can of beer you have ever opened. And when you put a 25% tariff on that flow of goods, you are not punishing foreign governments. You are taxing American manufacturers, American workers, and American consumers. The Trump tariffs are the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993 and amount to an average tax increase per U.S. household of $1,500 in 2026. Sit with that number, $1,500 per household, not charged to foreign governments, not extracted from Mexican drug cartel leaders or Canadian government officials, charged to you the American consumer, at the cash register, the car dealership, the grocery store. Households' income after taxes would fall by $930, just under 1%, in 2026 because of a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, according to a Tax Policy Center analysis. And those costs are only now beginning to fully cascade through the economy, because for most of 2025, businesses were absorbing the pain themselves rather than passing it on to customers. The United States collected $187 billion more in tariff revenue in 2025 than it did in 2024, a nearly 200% increase. Mostly businesses footed roughly 80% of the tariff bill last year, but businesses are starting to pass those costs along to customers, and that 80% could shrink to 20% later this year, according to JP Morgan. Think about what that means. The dam that has been holding back the full cost of these tariffs from reaching your wallet is about to break. The pain that corporate America absorbed in 2025 to keep customers spending is now going to show up in your prices. This is not speculation, this is the stated expectation of one of the largest banks in the world. Trump's tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, along with those countries' retaliatory tariffs, could wipe out 1.5 percentage points from U.S. gross domestic product growth in 2025 and another 2.1 percentage points in 2026, according to estimates by EY chief economist Gregory Dacko. Steep tariff increases against U.S. trading partners could create a stagflationary shock, a negative economic hit combined with an inflationary impulse, while also triggering financial market volatility, Dacko wrote. Stagflation, that word should trigger a memory for anyone old enough to remember the 1970s. Stagflation is the worst possible economic combination, rising prices and a shrinking economy at the same time. It is the scenario that breaks central banks, destroys political coalitions, and turns ordinary frustration into genuine social upheaval. And the professional forecasters are telling us, with increasing confidence, that this is the direction we are heading. The auto industry is perhaps the clearest window into how genuinely destructive this disruption can become. That's especially true in the auto industry, where parts often cross the border multiple times before a car arrives at the dealership. Wolf Research has estimated the price of a typical car sold in the United States could increase by $3,000 due to tariffs. Think about what it means when a car engine is machined in Michigan, shipped to a plant in Ontario to be fitted into a chassis, shipped back across the border to a finishing plant in Tennessee, and then shipped to a dealership in Texas. Each of those border crossings now carries a tax. The compounding effect of those tariffs on a single vehicle adds thousands of dollars to the final price, not because of any inefficiency in the production process, but simply because of where the invisible line on the map happens to run. And it is not just cars. Mexico is America's largest foreign source of fruit and vegetables, while Canada is #1 in grains, livestock, meats, and sugar and tropical products. The tariffs are very likely to cause higher prices for consumers, especially at the grocery store and on building materials. Now let's look at what is happening to the markets and what the volatility is actually signaling. On March 3rd, after Trump confirmed the imposition of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as well as the increase of tariffs on China from 10% to 20% set to take place the same day, the U.S. stock markets dropped considerably. The S&P 500 index fell by 1.8%, while the Nasdaq 100 index fell by 2.6%. By March 6th, the S&P 500 had lost almost all of its gains since November 2024. And when the broader round of global tariffs hit in April of 2025, the markets buckled even harder. After Trump's April 2nd tariffs, the S&P 500 fell over 10% in 2 days, in its worst week since the COVID-19 recession of 2020. $4 trillion of paper wealth evaporated in days. Meanwhile, there was a remarkable divergence happening. In Canada and Mexico, stock markets were more stable. By March 6th, Mexico's most prominent stock market index had risen 6% since the beginning of 2025. Canada's benchmark index was almost the same level it began the year. The markets in the two countries supposedly being punished were actually holding steadier than the markets in the country doing the punishing. Let that irony land. Now let's talk about how both targeted countries responded, because the contrast between Canada and Mexico is extraordinarily instructive. Mexico, under President Claudia Sheinbaum, chose a path of strategic patience and diplomatic dexterity. Sheinbaum offered insights into her mindset, saying that amid threats from Trump, Mexico needed to keep a cool head. This cautious strategy reflects Mexico's heavy reliance on the U.S. as a market. More than 75% of Mexico's exports go to its northern neighbor, so any dramatic disruption in that equation could bleed the country. And remarkably, that strategy worked, at least in the short term. In March, Trump said he decided to delay the tariffs out of respect for President Sheinbaum. He has called her a very wonderful woman. Mexicans appreciated Sheinbaum's deft negotiation, with thousands gathering in March to cheer for her. She told them, "We cannot cede our sovereignty." Her domestic approval rating soared to 85%. But the deeper strategic calculation Mexico was making was about something more fundamental than just delaying tariffs. Sheinbaum was simultaneously building Mexico's economic resilience from the inside, launching Plan Mexico, an ambitious infrastructure and industrial program designed to grow the Mexican economy and reduce its structural vulnerability to American policy shifts. And Canada's response has been revealing in ways that go far beyond economics. Trump also made repeated calls for Canada to be annexed by the United States as its 51st state, and said that while he would not use military coercion, he could use economic force to bring about Canadian annexation. Since the trade war began, Trudeau has said that Trump's comments should be taken as a serious threat against Canadian sovereignty and that Trump seeks to control Canada to access its mineral resources. When you threaten to erase the sovereignty of a nation that shares the world's longest peaceful international border with you, that nation's people do not forget. They restructure their economic relationships, diversify their trading partners, and begin building institutions designed to function without you. That is precisely what Canada is now doing, at a pace that should genuinely alarm anyone who understands what long-term geopolitical relationships actually mean. Since taking office, Carney has reacted by seeking to reduce Canada's long-term exposure to U.S. tariffs by diversifying trade while retaining remaining access to the U.S. market. The urgency this time is unmistakable. That urgency helps explain Carney's visit to Beijing, the first trip by a Canadian leader since 2017. Read that carefully. The Prime Minister of Canada, one of America's closest, oldest, most deeply trusted allies, made a pilgrimage to Beijing and sat down with Xi Jinping because the relationship with Washington had become so unpredictable and threatening that Beijing now looked like the more reliable partner. Carney's assertion that China has become a more predictable partner than the United States underscores Ottawa's frustration with Washington. That is a sentence that, even a decade ago, would have been unthinkable. Today, it is policy. And Carney was not just visiting Beijing. Carney announced he would travel to India, Australia, and Japan to unlock new opportunities for Canadian workers and businesses across trade, energy, technology, and defense. At Davos, Carney laid out the most ambitious articulation of Canada's new strategic posture. Canada has agreed a comprehensive strategic partnership with the EU, including joining SAFE, the European Defence Procurement Arrangements, and has signed 12 other trade and security deals on 4 continents in 6 months. 12 deals, 4 continents, 6 months. That is not the behavior of a country that expects to patch things up with its southern neighbor and go back to business as usual. The two targeted countries also began coordinating directly with each other in ways Washington should be watching very carefully. In a social media post, the federal government said that Sheinbaum and Carney agreed to maintain dialogue and agreed on the importance of the economic integration of North America with respect for our sovereignties as the best way to compete with other regions of the world. Carney noted, "In a shifting global economy, strong and reliable partners matter. Canada and Mexico are focused on deepening our trade relations and building stronger economies together." Canada and Mexico, the two countries the Trump administration was treating as adversaries, were building a more durable bilateral relationship with each other. The strategic boomerang was already in motion. Now let's talk about the legal architecture of all this, because here is where the story takes a turn that most people have not processed, a turn that changes how the entire episode needs to be understood. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that EPA does not authorize tariffs, leaving only the new Section 232 tariffs in place, effectively removing the central legal tool that had been used to justify the broadest tariff expansion. Trump responded by imposing a 10% tariff under Section 122, shifting the legal basis while keeping the economic pressure intact. The legal foundation that Trump used to impose the most sweeping tariffs in a generation was struck down by the nation's highest court, an extraordinary development in the legal and economic structure of U.S. trade policy. And rather than accepting the rebuke and recalibrating, rather than stepping back to reconsider the framework that had just been invalidated, the administration simply began rebuilding the tariff architecture on new legal foundations, piece by piece, statute by statute. The war is not ending. It is being reorganized, redirected through different legal channels. The tariffs could affect negotiations on renewing the USMCA, for which a review is due in 2026, a review that had originally been designed as a routine process. Canadian officials have grown concerned that Trump may threaten tariffs to force changes to the agreement, turning what was meant to be a procedural update into a leverage point in a broader confrontation. The USMCA review, which was supposed to be a technical procedural process, is now a high-stakes geopolitical negotiation taking place in an atmosphere of broken trust, active tariff pressure, and Supreme Court rulings, an environment where legal uncertainty and economic coercion overlap. And all of this is happening while allies simultaneously build new trade relationships with China, Europe, Japan, and India, specifically to reduce their dependence on American goodwill, quietly constructing alternatives in response to the instability they are experiencing. And what does the domestic political picture inside America look like under these circumstances, inside the country that is initiating these moves? A February 2025 survey by the Harris Poll for Bloomberg News found that around 60% of Americans believe that high tariffs could cause consumer prices to rise, an expectation forming well before the policy had fully played out. The following month, a poll by the University of Michigan found that the number of Americans expressing confidence in the economy fell by 11% in March 2025, a sharp shift in sentiment in a very short period of time. The same poll found that the number expecting inflation rose, indicating that households were already adjusting their expectations about the economic future. The American public understood what was happening to their wallets before most economists had finished publishing their papers about it, before the formal analysis had caught up with the lived experience of rising prices. People respond to the signals they feel in everyday life: the price at the store, the cost of basic goods, the sense that purchasing power is changing. Long before the academic discussion stabilizes around models and forecasts, the practical consequences are already being absorbed by ordinary households, and those consequences reshape how people think about the broader economic strategy being pursued. And here is the contradiction at the absolute heart of this project. The tariffs are also directly undermining the stated long-term strategic goal of competing with China, creating tension between the policy tools and the strategic objective. Continuing to make progress on secure supply chains will require greater trade and investment across North America to strengthen and diversify existing supply chains and reduce reliance on China-centered supply chains, a process that depends on deeper cooperation with neighbors. That means more integration, more coordination, more economic alignment across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The tariffs are directly at odds with deeper economic integration across North America because tariffs introduce friction precisely where integration requires openness and stability. Policies designed to restrict trade between partners weaken the very regional supply chain architecture that policymakers say they want to strengthen. In practice, the tools being used pull in the opposite direction from the strategy being described, and that contradiction becomes visible once the mechanics of supply chains are examined closely. In fact, China will benefit from a trade war across North America as it undercuts efforts to reshore supply chains away from China and back into the North American economic space. Disruption between the United States, Canada, and Mexico weakens the regional platform that was supposed to support that transition. The one country that is actually a genuine strategic challenger to American power is watching all of this with barely concealed satisfaction, observing the consequences of these internal frictions from a distance. From Beijing's perspective, every conflict inside the North American economic system is an opportunity to expand its own influence. Every tariff Washington imposes on Ottawa or Mexico City complicates the effort to build a cohesive regional production base. And every complication inside that system is a strategic opening for China's long-term project of constructing alternative trade networks, alternative supply chains, and ultimately an alternative world order that reduces the centrality of American economic leadership. Now let's pull back to the widest possible lens and talk about what all of this means for the global balance of power, because this is ultimately what this entire episode is about, and because the immediate headlines only capture a small portion of the deeper shift that may be underway. We are watching in real time the first major test of whether American economic dominance can be weaponized against allies without triggering a permanent reorganization of the global order, without provoking the kind of strategic adjustments that reshape how nations relate to one another. And the early results are not encouraging for anyone who believes in the continued centrality of American-led institutions. for anyone who assumes that the existing architecture of alliances will simply endure unchanged. Canada today faces US threats to diminish or even eliminate its sovereignty, threats that would have been almost unthinkable in the diplomatic language of previous decades. That said, Canada's economy and security remain so deeply dependent on America that it cannot risk rupturing the relationship now, cannot afford a clean break even if political pressure pushes in that direction. Canada's urgent task, therefore, is to do what is possible to maintain its historic position, close to the United States, yes, but increasingly independent of it, gradually creating more room for maneuver. That sentence, close to the United States, but increasingly independent of it, is the new strategic doctrine of one of America's oldest and most trusted allies, a quiet but unmistakable shift in posture. It is the diplomatic equivalent of a couple that has decided to stop sharing a bank account, a subtle change that signals something deeper in the relationship. They still live in the same neighborhood, they still interact in familiar ways, and they still share a long history of cooperation and proximity. They still talk, they still coordinate on many issues, and the outward appearance of the relationship may continue to look familiar. But they no longer trust each other with money, no longer assume that financial or strategic interests are perfectly aligned. And that loss of trust, once it takes root at this depth in this many institutions, across this many countries simultaneously, does not reverse itself quickly, does not simply fade away with time. It compounds, reinforcing itself through repeated decisions and adjustments that reflect the new reality. It calcifies, settling into bureaucratic routines, policy frameworks, and institutional habits that become difficult to unwind. It becomes the new normal, the background condition within which future diplomacy and economic planning take place. The question that history will eventually answer, and that you are living through the first chapters of right now, is whether this strategy of economic coercion actually strengthens America's long-term position in a world moving rapidly toward multipolarity, or whether it accelerates exactly the fracturing and realignment that its architects claim to be preventing, because the data we have so far suggests the latter, suggesting that the attempt to consolidate leverage may instead be producing dispersion of power. Trump views tariffs as an almost magical negotiating tool, a powerful way to gain leverage over friends and allies, a mechanism that can force concessions where traditional diplomacy might fail. But Trump's tariffs pose a big risk. They could backfire, lifting already high consumer prices at the grocery store, rocking the shaky stock market, or killing jobs in a full-blown trade war that spreads across multiple sectors. This may be the biggest own goal yet, said Mary Lovely, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. This is a huge gamble. It's a recipe for slowing down the economy and increasing inflation. Republican members of the House voted alongside Democrats to repeal